As with most things, the price of oil is mainly dictated by supply and demand. In the past, the supply was mainly determined by OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. The original group included Middle Eastern nations, but has grown to include countries across the globe. The main oil-producing countries meet every 2 years and set production quotas, and in the past, they've determined how much the world's advanced economies will be able to buy. The lower they set their quotas, the higher the price for importing countries. But if those countries experience an economic slowdown, then their demand for oil falls, and as a result, the price drops as well. As well as buying and selling crude oil to make petrol, there's also a market for oil futures. This means betting that the price of the stuff will go up or down. Buying futures above the current market rate can cause producers to hoard their oil, restricting supply and driving the cost up. So that's the economics. But what about the politics of oil? In the 1970s, OPEC stopped supplying oil to the US and other Western nations over their support for Israel. That forced prices up. And political instability in the region, which can slow down supply, has caused prices to spike periodically ever since. Ever since, the US has been trying to become more energy independent. They've become the world's second largest oil exporter. But one day the supply will run out, and in the meantime it'll become more expensive to extract. So now the US is doing more and more fracking. That's getting natural gas from the earth. This could reduce demand for oil in a big way, and mean the era of OPEC's power at the pump is at an end.
There are three things going on. One is the United States became a much bigger producer of oil than it had been really since the 1980s, I'd say. We were producing, let's say, 5, 6, 7 years ago, about 5 million, 5.5 million barrels of oil a day. Now we're producing about 9.7 million barrels of oil a day. So that's in part because of the fracking techniques and other specialized techniques that enable us to get more oil out of the ground. So we were producing more in the United States, and we were a swing factor. Secondly, a number of other OPEC nations non-OPEC nations were also producing more. Canada was producing more than had before through the tar sands. Russia was producing more. And as a result, you had a lot of people outside of OPEC producing more oil than had been produced in recent years. Secondly, the consumption was going down. There was slow growth in China. The US was growing less. Europe was growing less. So you have a lot of people producing more oil, people consuming less. And then the precipitating factor was really this, in my view. OPEC really had controlled oil prices more or less, with some exaggeration, but they had a big impact on it. And the Saudis really were controlling, to a large extent, OPEC. They decided that they didn't want to do what they normally did when prices were going down. When prices were going down very often, or prices were at a level that the Saudis weren't happy with, they could prop them up and get them higher by cutting production. So you have less oil, and therefore price goes up. Because the price was going down, because more oil was being produced, the Saudis said, well, normally they would cut their own production, therefore reducing supply and keeping prices up. But the Saudis said, no, we don't want to do that. We did that before, and what happens is we lose market share. So we're not going to produce less oil. They did ask other OPEC nations if they would produce less oil, and none of them were willing to do so. The Saudis said, we're not going to produce less if nobody else in OPEC is going to produce less. So the Saudis said, we're going to produce the same amount we're producing. All the OPEC nations said they would produce the same, and the result was you had more oil than before. And the Saudis made a determination that it was more important for them, and maybe they made the right business decision, to not lose market share. They were concerned that if they cut production, customers they had developed in India and China and Asia would go to other people who had oil, and they thought that that would actually hurt them. They did that once before. So a large part of what was going on is we had lower growth, less demand, but more people are producing oil because of new techniques, produced more oil. So you had a supply imbalance, really, and then the Saudis didn't want to adjust to it by cutting their production, which they historically had done. So this has happened before, as you said, and typically, in my view, it takes about 2 to 3 years before you go back to the price that you had before. In this case, though, I don't think you're going to go back at quite that level. I think the Saudis had said publicly for many years, Saudi oil minister, they were quite happy keeping oil at about $100 a barrel. When it's at $100 a barrel, the political unrest in the United States are concerned about about oil prices isn't so great. If it went to $150 a barrel, then you have political unrest, and political unrest in the United States would not be good for the Saudis for a lot of reasons. So they were happy at $100 a barrel. What they didn't probably calculate, in hindsight, they might say, is that at $100 a barrel, we were producing so much oil in the United States through new techniques that we were producing more oil in the world than maybe the world really needed. And the Saudis, therefore, would probably say if the world went back to $80 a barrel oil, it might actually be better because it wouldn't produce so many people trying to produce more oil when oil is at $90, $100, or $110 a barrel. So this will play out, I think, over another 2 or 3 year period of time. And ultimately, I think oil prices will come back, but they may not go back to 100 because I think some of the people in OPEC would be happy to keep it at a lower level so it doesn't induce so many people in the United States and other places to produce more oil than maybe the world needs.
Thanks very much.